topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Alise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, which has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. If we've not met before and you don't know me, I'm an organizational psychologist and logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Gusto now help companies enliven and fortify their operations by building a dynamic, high-performance culture and inspirational leadership activated by meaning and purpose. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com or my personal site, alisecortez.com. Now, getting into today's program, we have with us today Dr. Christopher Wong Michaelson, a philosopher with 25 years of experience advising business leaders, pursuing meaning and providing work with a purpose. He is the Barbara and David A. Koch Coach Endowed Chair in Business Ethics and Academic Director of the Melrose and the Toro Company Center for Principled Leadership at the University of St. Thomas and the Business and Society faculty for NYU's Stern School of Business. Also, we have with us Dr. Jennifer Tosti-Kharas, who is the Camellia Latino Spinelli Endowed Term Chair and Professor of Management at Babson College. She teaches researchers and coaches others about what it means to craft a meaningful career and appreciate the risks and rewards of work as a calling. Together, they have written, Is Your Work Worth It? How to Think About Meaningful Work, which we'll be talking about on today's podcast. Christopher joins us from Minneapolis, and Jennifer joins us from Boston. Christopher and Jen, welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thank you so much, Alise. We're so happy to be here.
I'm glad that you were recruitable. I reached out to you when I saw your beautiful book, and I was like, this is solid fodder for Working on Purpose. I have got to have them. So thank you for saying yes.
Thank you so much for asking us.
Welcome. So since our listeners and viewers have not met you the way that I have, because I read my guest books cover to cover, as you now know, and I know something about both of you, but they don't. So let's just, if we could, open with each of you talking a little bit about your background and how you found your way into academia, because that wasn't your original start.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to start. So I was an undergraduate business major, and I thought I would definitely go into either management consulting or investment banking. But along the way, I was a TA for a class, and that's where I really got this academic bug. I really, really wanted to get experience on the other side of the classroom. I knew what being a student was like, but I didn't know what being a professor was like. I then went on to become a management consultant, living and working in New York City, doing strategy consulting and traveling a lot. And it was all very exciting. But after the 9/11 attacks, like many New Yorkers, I reconsidered, what am I doing and why? And decided to apply for a PhD program in management in organizational behavior, which is my field. So I have a lot of training in organizational psychology. And the rest is history. From there, I went on to become a full-time professor, scholar, teacher, and author.
Love it. There's some interesting similarities there. Christopher?
So our experiences converged in New York City around 9/11, and we both changed careers after 9/11 within a year or two. But otherwise, my journey is pretty much the exact opposite. I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate, and I never gave even a thought to management consulting or investment banking. Those meant nothing to me whatsoever. But I wanted to make a difference in the real world. And I realized after getting a PhD in philosophy where I could study the meaning of life that I didn't really want to be in an insular philosophy department studying smaller questions than the meaning of life. I wanted to make a difference in the real world. And so I actually helped launch a business ethics advisory practice in one of the large management consulting firms. And that's how I ended up in the same place around the same time in New York City as Jen. And then it was just sort of by luck and happenstance that I got asked to teach what I was consulting in back in academia. And I went back into academia, and this was our first research project together, studying the meaning of work in the lives of 9/11 victims.
Which was beautiful how you write about it in your book, really beautiful. I will just quickly say that, and to piggyback off both of your stories, a part of my reason for getting a PhD, which we will get into later, was it was probably my best reaction to my early onset midlife crisis. And I also studied meaning in work and identity actually earlier on, which is what kind of got me into this camp. So the three of us have some very interesting overlaps here. Now, what didn't factor in for me really per se into my journey, except that I was on the West Coast for it, was 9/11. So what I'd love to do next, I really appreciate what you've done in your book, is you've situated how both 9/11 and the COVID-19 pandemic really situated or changed a lot of things in relation to how we think about our lives, what we want from our lives, and from our work. So if you could talk about each of those as separate incidences and how they did impact us, especially from in the realm of work.
Yeah. So the 9/11 attacks were, among other things, a workplace tragedy. The vast majority of those who died in the attacks died at work, either at the Twin Towers or as first responders sort of coming in to the Twin Towers, many of whom, by the way, were off duty, but just couldn't not help. So in the wake of those attacks, people have a mortality salience, as we say in psychology, where suddenly they become aware of the fact that they will die and that it may not happen on the timetable that they might expect. So suddenly it becomes this existential question of, how am I spending my time? You know, how I spend my days is how I spend my weeks, months, years, and then ultimately my life. And the saying is, no one on their deathbed ever wishes they spent more time at the office. But the fact is, we all spend a lot of time at work. For some of us, it's the majority of our waking hours are spent at work. So to not contemplate what role work plays, it's just a big way to make a change in your life, to make life potentially more meaningful, or maybe less meaningless is the way to say it. And so something then very similar happened in COVID, where we saw, for example, the Great Resignation, where people said, again, life is too short to do a job where I don't see an impact, or I'm not getting, at the very least, what I want from the work that I'm doing. And so even though these were very different types of events, the impact was sort of similar. And Christopher and I sometimes say we wrote the book so that absent a gigantic global crisis, people would ask these deep existential questions. It shouldn't have to take a crisis to make us ask these deep existential questions about what we're doing for work and why.
So appreciate that. What a beautiful explanation. So then I want to go on and situate really why, as you situate why you wrote the book. So you say this book is not going to tell you what to do with your work, but it is going to tell you to do the work that is worth it, whatever that may be. It is about the priority of work worth doing in a life worth living. That is like, just for me, where it's at.
Well, Jen was talking about post 9/11, and people who were alive back then might remember that we were exhorted to go back to work on September 12th. Don't let the terrorists win. They wanted to shut down our economy. They wanted to shut down our organizations. And so the best thing that we could do was to show up. And to this day, 9/11, despite it being a day of mourning, is not a holiday, because it's a day on which we show up to work. But then after the pandemic, or during the pandemic, I think there were at least two classes of people who were thinking in different ways about work. There were the office workers or sort of privileged professors like us who could still do their work from the comfort of their homes. And in some sense, were thinking, this is kind of a nice gig. I get to wear my pajama bottoms while I'm working and take a break in the middle of the day, and my dogs are nearby, my family's nearby. But then there were the people who had to show up on the front lines. And oftentimes their work was worth the least in terms of the economic value that it was assigned, but arguably worth the most with regard to how urgent it was. Maybe there's a third group of employees that I didn't think about, which was people who were involuntarily out of work. So it just led everybody to sort of reassess, what is work worth doing in a life worth living? And those questions, as Jen said, are salient after a terrorist attack, during a pandemic, or any time.
Mm-hmm. I think it's worth noting that you have a whole chapter devoted to answering the question, what is work? So would you help us understand how you describe what is work?
Yeah, I like to joke here that philosophers can we could spend literally the rest of this podcast with philosophers debating what is work. So Christopher and I, so that's why I'm taking this question, and also why we tried to be really specific in the book about what do we mean when we say work. The very simplest definition that sort of applies is what we tend to think of as paid employment. I mean, what comes to someone's mind when we say work is probably what we mean, but we get a little bit more specific than that. We say work is that which is effortful, purposeful, and this is the key, recognized by society generally as work. And a key distinction here is something like housework, raising children, doing the chores around the house. When we do it for ourselves, it is not societally recognized as work, even though we know it is very effortful and very purposeful, right? But when we pay someone to do it for us, then it becomes work. And so certainly one can, and people have quibbled with such definitions about what counts as work. And I'm not sure our societal definitions always get it right. But for our purposes, we're trying to take it as, what we would generally consider to be paid employment generally fits with what we mean when we are talking about work in the book.
Even though we recognize the ridiculousness of letting tax policymakers decide what work is.
Yeah, I know. I remember you have some examples in your book, like, for example, if somebody were to come into your house and clean it for you, that is payable work. But if you do it yourself, it's not considered work.
Right.
Which is fascinating. So I just really had to have you distinguish this idea of what is work. Well, let's go on to then, why do we work? Boy, there is a multitude of reasons why we work. And I also coded for that too when I did my research. Why do we work?
Jen, I'm going to let you answer this one because this is based on the research of your dissertation advisor.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we work for reasons that are beyond this typology that I'm about to say that was developed by my dissertation advisor. But Amy Resnesky, who I was lucky to work with when I was getting my PhD.
I know of her. Yes, I revere her.
And she's like as wonderful a person and a mentor as a scholar. I can attest to that. But she popularized an idea that was first written about actually within sociology about, how do we engage in civic society? And part of it was about why do people work? And there were three different categories: a job, a career, and a calling. And a job, and obviously these all have meanings. These words have meanings outside of this typology, but for the purposes of why we work, a job is when we work primarily for external rewards and typically money. So we're sort of in it for the money, and it maybe fuels a meaningful life outside of work, but the work itself is not, we're kind of not we're working as a means to an end, not a meaningful end unto itself. The second is a career. And so when we view our work as a career, we're in it for, again, external rewards, but this time it's more about ascending within either an organizational hierarchy, climbing a career ladder, if you will, or gaining centrality within an occupational or industrial community. So think about open source coders who really could care less about status within their organization, but want respect and maybe to be cited or built upon within the coding community. And then the last one is, and this is where a lot of my research has been around, is viewing work as a calling. A concept which originally had religious origins. It was a calling from God or a higher power. The Protestants used it, of course, though explicitly as God, but which we use in and is used in the research in a secular context to mean here is where work is a meaningful end in and of itself. So work is a source of deep passion. It's meaningful. It often, but not always, does good in the world. It makes the world a better place and helps others. But again, there are reasons to work, in terms of why we work, that go beyond that. So we work to have something to, a way to pass the time. Some of us work because of a deep relationship with our coworkers. We love the camaraderie of the workplace. Some people are more about the craftsmanship that comes with their work, or gaining, excellence or expertise in something for its own sake. So again, this typology is not meant to be all-inclusive, and it's obviously not, but it's what scholars have drawn upon to get at some really fundamental differences in why we tend to work, broad categories, and how those tend to matter for individual and organizational outcomes.
Beautifully explained. I will comment on that, but let's take our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We've been on the air with Dr. Christopher Wong Michaelson, a philosopher with 25 years of experience advising business leaders pursuing meaning and providing work with a purpose, and Dr. Jennifer Tosti-Kharas, who teaches, researches, and coaches others about what it means to craft a meaningful career and appreciate the risks and rewards of work as a calling. We've been talking a bit about some of the interesting parts of the first part of their book, including why we work and what is work. After the break, we're going to get into discussing when and how much should we work. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us, and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. As I, too, am dedicated to helping create a world where people realize their potential at work, are led by inspirational leaders that help them find and contribute their greatness, and we do business that betters the world. I continue to research and write my own books. So one of my latest books came out in March of 2023. It's called The Great Revitalization, Play on the Resignation, How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And I wrote it to help leaders understand the discerning needs and wants of today's workforce, and then provide 22 best practices to build into your culture to provide that. You can find my books on Amazon or check them out on my personal website, alisecortez.com. If you are just now joining us, my guest is first, Christopher Wong Michaelson, and also Jennifer Tosti-Kharas. They are the authors of Is Your Work Worth It? How to Think About Meaningful Work, which is what we've been talking about today. So speaking about those three orientations, and I remember Dr. Amy's work, I came across it some time ago. That meaning and work research that I did, I looked at how people, what did they find meaningful about their work, and how did they relate to their work? And so in those two things, the relationship to work and also the kind of meaning, I found 15 modes of engagement. And I would say the first couple relate to the calling, the ones in the middle are more career. The bottom middle segment is definitely job. And then there's the negative segment, which is when it's actually negatively experienced. But very interesting. I was thinking about that as I was preparing, that there's some really interesting feed to that. Okay, so now the great question. So many people, one of the things I like to think about is how the younger generations have taught us that we really don't have to work 80 to 90 hours a week. I really appreciate that about you, Gen Y and Gen Z. So when and how much should we work is the next topic.
So I was recently speaking about the book at a conference in the French Alps, and we took a van from the airport to the conference site. And the other people in the van, some of them were going to the conference, and a couple of them were dressed like hikers with giant backpacks. And everybody who was going to the conference was name dropping and talking about all the important things that they'd done. And these two other people were just sort of keeping to themselves. My wife and I were the last ones in the van with them. And then we started talking with them, and they'd been listening to the entire conversation. And they were two people who used to work for one of the big four professional services firms and decided that work, the way that it is usually done, was not for them anymore. And they were going to work for a year and then take a year off, and work for a year and take a year off. And they were in the midst of one of their years off, and they were going hiking in the French Alps while everybody else was going to network and work really hard. And it was hard not to think that they were the right ones in the van, and all these other, quote, important people were the wrong ones. We talk in the book about several stages of life, and I'm not going to go through all of them here, but I'll just say, in an oversimplified way, our lives are divided into pre-working years, when we go to school, preparing to work, and then our working years, all in service to our post-working years. And one thing that we tragically discovered in our research on 9/11 and the pandemic is that all too many people don't make it to those post-working years. Mm-hmm. So why are we trading present happiness for a future happiness that might never come? Secondly, there's been research done through the ages that suggests that most people, especially in affluent markets, their happiness bottoms out when their earning power is highest. Yeah. So it seems like we are wasting some of the best years of our lives by working too much or working at the wrong things. And that's why we have to ask, when should we work? Meaning when in our lives, but also how much should we work? And when in the day should we work? Given the fact that work often separates us from the people who matter most.
That was, there's so much you said in that we could go further into. And at the same time, because I want to get as much out of you as we possibly can, I would love for you to also talk about what you wrote about in your book, The Schedules That Work Act. There are two examples in there that really took my breath away. And one was the Dunkin' Donuts example. The other one was the Amazon example. Could you just share with our listeners and viewers what we mean by those two examples? What was going on?
Sure. These were both examples of people who died. Well, one died at work. This is the Amazon example. And unfortunately, there are several such examples of Amazon employees essentially working in the warehouses, essentially dropping dead on the job, likely from overwork and these unreasonable schedules, no bathroom breaks, all these things that are now sort of famous about Amazon warehouse working conditions and justifications for at least some of them to have successfully unionized. But employees were told, keep working, basically like ignore the corpse and keep working, like nothing stops the clock. Really kind of this very dark underside of modern day capitalism. The other example was a woman who was working multiple jobs. One of them was at a Dunkin' Donuts. She was napping in her car in between the shift, and died. And, just this notion that we have to work, many people have to work multiple jobs with unpredictable schedules at all hours of the day and night, not prioritizing even basic needs in service of simply making ends meet. And this ended up being a foundation for the Schedules That Work Act, which says in part that employers have to give sufficient notice before changing an employee's schedule so that at least employees can know what are the work hours, making sure they're regulated, and being able to plan their work and life accordingly. I'll note just this Amazon example. I teach a class at Babson that partly uses films about work to better understand the nature and culture of the workplace. And one of the films that we show is Norma Ray, which is a famous movie about from the 1970s about a very unhealthy factory workplace that ends up successfully unionizing, and this union push and the management opposition to it. And I mean, that was decades ago. And just to think that we are in the 2020s, and conditions for many people remain the same as in those days, and the fight for labor protections continues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's definitely news that I don't normally get my nose into. So I just thought that was really important and really quite sobering for me to really know that this is still out there happening in the 2020s. I want to move on to the idea of, should we work for love or money? And sometimes I recognize that I have a very strong bias here. And I made some choices in my life, some very definitive choices. And so when I'm working with people, I try to remember that I have a value set and a bias set. But your perspective on, should we work for love or money?
So it's funny that Jen just shared an example from modern film, because we often joke that she's the pop culture aficionado and I'm the snob. So
it's true.
I'm going to share an example from modernist painting. The artist Paul Gauguin, we tell a version of his story in the book.
Yes.
This is a story that's sort of become more of a legend than necessarily truth, because it's been studied by philosophers, it's been fictionalized by novelists and filmmakers. But essentially, as the legend goes, Paul Gauguin was a workaday stock trader supporting a middle-class family in 19th century Paris, and was bored with his work, had always wanted to be in the art world. And so in order to sort of address some of his longings to be in that world, he started trading paintings. But then there was a stock market crash. He lost his job. He had trouble finding another job and supporting his family. And so eventually he just left them with relatives and left them. He first set sail for the Caribbean. Things didn't work out. He spent some time with his buddy Vincent van Gogh, who is also a little bit, crazy, let's say. And eventually he abandoned his family permanently and set sail for the South Seas, where he painted many of the canvases that now hang pricelessly in museums. And one of the questions that we're trying to raise by telling the story of Paul Gauguin is, if you become a great artist, then isn't it okay to be kind of a morally bankrupt human being? If he loved his work that much and hated his work that much as a stockbroker, is there something admirable about his choice? I personally think that he sounds like an awful human being, but I am grateful that he lived his life so that we could tell his story in a way that raises the kinds of questions that we have to think about as we trade off happiness for sustenance and sometimes forsake our passions. On the other hand, maybe he should have thought more of the work that he was doing to support a family that was certainly worthy of his love, even though he didn't extend his love to it.
There is so much in that question, and that's why I had to have you talk about it, because I know that there are listeners and viewers that can relate to both sides of that equation. Gauguin, who wanted to pursue his passion, and the family who left behind that maybe struggled quite a bit. So there's just so much in that, and all the more reason that I really appreciate what you put forward in your book. You said, instead of choosing the work we need to support the lifestyle we want, what if we looked at it the other way around? That is, by choosing the lifestyle we can afford within the limits imposed by the work we aspire to do. That sounds pretty good to me, and kind of what I've done.
Yeah.
You want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, we, our students, so Christopher and I both teach in colleges. And so we teach students who are wondering, for example, my first job out of college, should I go for love or money? We teach at business schools, and this idea of I have to be an investment banker or I have to be a consultant because I know I'm going to work really hard, but I want to make just a ton of money. A lot of our students think they're going to work unbelievably long hours in their 20s and be set for life, and then live a life of leisure or doing whatever it is that they want to do. And so, just we understand that at some time it makes sense, especially, and I mean, back to these examples of these workers trying to make ends meet. It is expensive to buy a home in the cities in which, we both live. Students are graduating with debt. There are lots of reasons why they might prioritize money over meaning in especially their first job out of college. But the idea that, we're on this treadmill, so to speak, of earning, where we feel like if we just made a little bit more, then it would be enough. And it's never enough. This is sort of a well-documented phenomenon that there's some, percentage of what our salary is that we wish we made that much more. And that, the quote that you mentioned speaks to the possibility that that day will never come when we actually feel like that's it. I've made it. I've achieved the desired lifestyle, and now I can stop. And so it's a little bit of how do we, and there can be a trade-off. And in many, many industries, there is a trade-off where the work that pays the most comes with strings attached, and the work that is the most meaningful is not the one that is going to afford second homes and early retirements and all these kinds of things that we might want. But how do we make peace with what we can justify trading off that allows us to feel like we're making enough to live, but maybe not trying to match some either societal expectation or cultural expectation that is not actually valuable or meaningful to us.
The $1 billion question. Never mind the $1 million question, the $1 billion question. All right, well, let's let our listeners and viewers stew on that while we take our next break. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We've been on the air with Dr. Christopher Wong, Michaelson, a philosopher of 25 years with experience advising business leaders pursuing meaning and providing work 25 years experience advising business leaders pursuing meaning and providing work with a purpose. And also Jennifer Tosti-Kharas, who teaches, researches, and coaches others about what it means to craft a meaningful career and appreciate the risks and rewards of work as a calling. After the break, we're going to get into further that notion of calling, both the risks as well as the rewards. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. I mentioned in the last break that my latest book came out in 2023, The Great Revitalization. What I did for you is I created a simple 3-page organizational assessment to help you ascertain the extent to which your current culture meets the standards and of today's discerning workforce. You can find it on my website, gusto-now.com. If you are just now joining us, my guest is Dr. Christopher Wong Michaelson and Dr. Jennifer Tosti-Kharas, the authors of Is Your Work Worth It? How to Think About Meaningful Work. So this next question is definitely near and dear to my heart. It does speak to the perils, if you will, or the risks of pursuing a calling. And I appreciated so much that you talk about this notion that we are in this calling culture. And when I'm out speaking to audiences and the topic of purpose comes up, people are literally, there's this palpable feeling of, but I don't know, and I feel so bad that I don't know what my purpose is. And there's a shoulding and something that goes along with that. So want to hear your perspective. I don't know if that's you, Jen, because I know it's a lot of your research that will speak to first the risks of pursuing a calling.
Yeah, I mean, just as you said, Alise, we are in a moment where we tell people, and it's well-intentioned advice, but we tell them things like, these are actual book titles, do what you love and the money will follow, find your calling, love your life. Steve Jobs in his famous, 2005 Stanford University commencement address told people in the audience that the only way to do great work is to do what you love. And if you haven't found it yet, keep looking, don't settle. So these are very unsubtle cues that we should be doing work we love, finding our calling early on, as early as possible, that this is a key ingredient for a successful and happy life. And we see, again, from our students and others who we come into contact with in our own consulting and coaching, a real angst about, if I don't know what that is,
Yep.
Am I doing it wrong? Have I already failed? I mean, so, 19, 20-year-old students in college who feel like they've already failed because they have failed to identify their calling. So part of what I want this book to do is demystify that not everybody finds their callings early and journeys toward it. Many people figure it out as they go. And often the best thing that we can do is go out and have experiences, good, bad, or otherwise, to learn from, rapidly learn, iterate, pivot. It's very similar to how we describe design thinking or entrepreneurial mindset. Do things, learn from it, and you'll get closer. And, there are people who feel their work is a calling despite they weren't the little kids imagining, this is my destiny and I'm going to do a certain line of work one day. So I just want to dispel that notion of there's sort of one path or one desired path to a calling and it happens early. Lots of people find their callings, later in life. Totally fine. The other thing is, maybe myth to dispel, is that a calling is in fact a surefire path to a great life. So there are many risks and perils to work as a calling. So part of what makes callings so powerful is that they are almost can borderline on the obsessive. So when we feel a strong calling toward our work, we'll often seek to perform that work at all costs. Those costs could be cost to us in terms of taking the breaks from work we need, putting in too many hours, especially without compensation that justifies those hours. So from an organization's perspective, these are the great employees who will go above and beyond. And, I always know I can call on them because they're so dedicated. But at what point does this become a potential for employee exploitation? So the very thing that makes me love my work potentially sets me up to do too much of it and, potentially to my own, ultimately my own detriment. I do worry about strongly calling oriented employees, giving too much of themselves from work, not being able to disengage in a healthy way from work, having strained relationships with others at work. These are all, documented outcomes of feeling a strong calling toward work, being critical of an employer because, well, that's not how I think it should be done. And that's not, in line with my calling. It can be a tough path. And it can be a path that puts my doing of the work, my way or at all costs before other considerations about what might make my life actually good.
That's quite a spectrum to navigate there. Before we get into a little bit more of thinking about work having a higher purpose, I do want to talk about this notion of, this was fascinating what you wrote about in your book, and I do remember this being discussed during the pandemic, is what work can't society do without. I think they might be able to do without my work. I'm not so sure, but other work I'm not so sure about.
Well, as we talk about this, I keep thinking people might be wondering, is talking about meaningful work, is dreaming of work you love, is that a privilege only available to a few people? What about those people who don't have the skills, the education to pursue work that they love and make a living? There is a famous framework often referred to as ikigai. It's a Japanese term that roughly translates to reason for being, that suggests that your purpose is to be found at the intersection of 4 questions. One question is, what are you good at? Another is, what do you love? Another is, what can you be paid for? And the 4th is escaping me as I speak.
What does the world need? Yeah.
What can society not do without? Yeah.
Thank you. Well, the very question that we were talking about right now. Yeah. And that's a really nice set of questions to think about when you think about the possibility of pursuing your purpose. But most people won't find work that actually answers all 4 of those questions at one time. Many might not even find work that answers all of those questions over the course of a career, but that's certainly something that might be worth aiming for, to think about, well, right now I need work that I can be paid for, that I have the skills to actually perform. And maybe at this point in my life, I need to get my financial feet under me so that at some future point, I can pursue work that I love, or give to the world in the form of work that the world needs. So I think it's really important for us to think about the kinds of privilege that allow us to ask these questions. But I think it's also important to recognize that even those who may not have the privilege to answer these questions might still be wondering about these questions. The title of the book is Your Work Worth It? And everybody at some point on the verge of exhaustion wonders if it's worth it, even if they don't have the wherewithal to make a change. And I think one thing that does is it sort of puts a burden on the people who do have the ability to make a change, to think about not just the meaning of their own work, but also the value of the work that they are providing.
I have to interject at this point. If you don't know Bea Bocolandro and her work, she's a colleague of mine in the purpose community. She wrote a book, I forget what it's called now, but essentially what she's putting forth is the notion of no matter what our job is, whether we think it's the cream of the crop and it curls our toes and it's purposeful or whatever it is, and we can always sneak in this thing called job purposing or social purposing. And that is the idea that, whatever we're doing during the course of the day, we can always find some way to lift and help somebody else in a way that gives us that sense of purpose, that we are doing something above and beyond, and we are helping other people. Really quick example of that is she talks about a man who he parks cars for a living. He's a parking attendant in a garage. And while the people are away after they've given him the keys to their cars, he goes around and measures the tread on their tires. And he reports back to the owners when they come back if they're low. And he has, of course, saved many people from blowing a tire on a freeway. And that's his way of just sneaking a little bit of purpose for him. So what I love about that is it doesn't matter what we're doing. We can always find a way to sneak in a little bit of that good purpose stuff.
I love that story. And we've been talking about thinking about loving our work. And one thing that we often say is a takeaway from this book is that we should be thinking more, not just about what makes us love our work, but what is worth loving about our work. And that's an example of what makes maybe modest work lovable.
Mm. I had a whole question for that, actually, if you wanted to take that a little bit further. What would make your life worth living in a world without work? And so I don't know which one of you want to take that, but I mean, for me, let me back up and say that I was raised by farmers and restaurateurs, and work was a way of life.
Yeah.
It was an expression of being alive. It was a noble thing. So to me, every work is worth it. But let me let you comment.
Well, I think that we don't give enough respect to just the fundamental dignity of doing work that is useful. And farming is a great example of that. We started, as I mentioned before, our research examining the role of work in the lives of 9/11 victims. And when Jen talks about this typology, job, career, calling, one thing that we did was draw on that typology in order to understand the stories of the victims that we were reading about. And we discovered not only was that framework useful for understanding the role of work in their lives, but we also, in the course of examining it, wanted to challenge that very framework that we were using. So when I think of work that's a job, we were looking at victims often who were among the wealthiest people on Wall Street. A job could be seeking to be the biggest, baddest trader on Wall Street. But we also read stories about people who were restaurant workers who were delivering food to those traders and doing so that they could support a family. And in that sense, we discovered that not all jobs, even though they are all means to material ends, are created equal. And we should appreciate more that sense of dignity and love that's involved in the simple work of supporting a family, which might be the most fundamental of all reasons why people work.
There's so much more we could talk about. Your book is so thorough and robust. And I saw that you have another book coming out 2025. So we'll just have to have you back on and talk more anyway. But let me give each of you a chance to close the conversation. This show is listened to by people around the world who are interested in becoming better leaders themselves, who are looking to help create cultures where people actually want to come to work and do their best. Let me give you each a chance to close with something, say about 20 seconds each.
Yeah. I really would love your listeners to think about not only why they personally work, but why each of your employees come to work. What is their why, and is the organization meeting their why?
And I'd like to encourage your listeners to think about how they would explain their work to a 7-year-old, because if you have trouble explaining the value of your work to a 7-year-old, then it might be time to sort of rethink, why is it worth doing?
Wow, what a powerful way to finish. Jen and Christopher, I'm so happy to know both of you. I've learned a lot from you. I do look forward to having you back on the show if you'll come back. Listeners, she's saying yes. So at least
we would love it. We're honored, Alise. Thank you.
Couple witnesses here, maybe. Okay, so listeners and viewers, you are going to want to learn more about both of these beautiful humans and the work that they're doing. And the best way to do that is really to go to ChristopherWongMichaelson.com. I will spell that out for you. So it's Christopher, standard spelling, Wong, W-O-N-G, Michaelson, E-M-I-C-H-A-E-L-S-O-N, ChristopherWongMichaelson.com. Go check them out. You can find more about the book and some of their work as well. You can also find them ways to be able to connect with them that way too. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it via recorded podcast or wherever you get your podcast. We were on with Matt Schenker, the founder of Mattermore. We talked about his creation of the empowered well-being theory, a transdisciplinary biopsychosocial spiritual model for understanding human well-being, and the work they are doing to harness the best of AI and behavior science to empower the future of work, and what they call Work 4.0. Next week, we'll be on with Shakti Dudley and Alan Prusham, talking about their joint venture championing inspirational and spiritual leadership among executives. See you there, and for another inspiring and educational conversation on working on purpose. And remember, work is one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.